and then you have rules of engagement that may be far less than adequate. And I remember on one trip to Darfur, I met with a colonel who was there. This was early on after the African Union troops were deployed there, and he said, you know, and he got me aside. He goes, I was in Sarajevo when we had very, very weak rules of engagement, and he says it feels an awful lot like this here. And of course, we keep hearing now how they're making it better, but you know, I just hope we don't have a terrible deja vu of what happened in Bosnia, as well as what happened, of course, in Sudan itself. So if you could perhaps touch on those issues. And I want to thank all of our very distinguished witnesses for your testimony.
Congressman, you ask very critical questions, and the answers are difficult, but I'll try to measure up to your concern. I would start by saying UNMISS is the only instrument you and we and all of us have in Sudan right now, and we have to use it to the best possible extent. I think we must not forget, one is that these peacekeeping missions work at the consent of governments. This is a tremendous limitation on how far they will go in case of conflict, in particular if government forces or government sympathizers are involved in the conflict. The second one is that they are not sufficiently equipped, and as I said, some of the equipment they have is under threat of being withdrawn right now. So there I think that certainly through advocacy with the administration, but also with other government, there has to be put a lot of pressure on governments that can step up the equipment that is provided to UNMISS.
Does some of that blame lay at our doorstep here?
No, not particularly. I think I would say the international community. I do not know exactly the details of funding, but when some governments are withdrawing such critical elements as helicopter in a country where distances and communications are so critical, I think to leave the peacekeeping mission without the capacity to respond quickly is unacceptable. And I think we have to find out, and perhaps outside this event, who really can support. But it's a general concern for the international community, I would say. The third point, I think it's critical that despite their limitations, UNMISS could play a role if they carried out a very careful assessment of where are the most likely areas of conflict and focus their resources there to try to act as much as possible as a deterrent. The longer-term issue, which is how are peacekeepers equipped to protect civilians, is a long-standing dialogue. I mean, Refugees International have advocated for a long time that this should be part of their mandate. It is now under the authority they have, so there has been some progress. I would argue that the culture in peacekeeping missions is not yet completely centered on civilians, but there is some progress in this direction, and we must keep up the pressure so that these missions do shape up better in training their officers on how to deal with civilian population, which is not a classic training of soldiers. You know, it does require a completely different approach. But I would say it's our only instrument. Let's try to put as much support and as much pressure at the same time so they do the best possible job in what I would say is an unsatisfactory status.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Smith, for your question about the safe havens. Well, I share the same concern than you, but the word or the expression has been used in the discussion in the country team in Sudan. Should the people not be able to move to areas of safety at borders or in neighboring countries, we have to think of safe havens. I hope the lessons from the past have been learned and will be applied to this situation if it comes to the worst. You have to understand it's politically very sensitive to talk publicly or to talk with neighboring countries about worst-case scenario, because we don't want to be seen as preparing for it or for a collapse of the CPA. But obviously discussions are taking place on what would be possible corridors, but mainly to bring people to safety to neighboring countries in the south. So that's Ethiopia, that's Sudan, that's Uganda. Difficulty might be more complex for southerners in the north who may not be able to go southwards, and the only option for them would be to move to Libya or to Egypt, and there it's going to be more complicated.
With your permission, Congress, I just wanted to ask one thing. if the referendum takes place, it's very likely that the peacekeeping mission will be re-extended. And I think what we would recommend is that it should not be a rollover under the same terms, but the aspect of protection of civilians should be much more reinforced in its mandate. And I think this is something where we can all put some pressure on. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I just have a couple of questions, and it goes to this question of contingency planning, because it does seem that in your testimony you are expressing at least some doubt that the timing that we're talking about is really January for a referendum. And maybe I'm reading too much skepticism in that, and so you can confirm that when you respond. But given that, on this issue of contingency planning, whenever any kind of sort of tragic spiral of events happens, and humanitarian organizations and entities, the UNHCR, on the ground, that there comes a question of who is really responsible for security, security that enables the continued deliverance of humanitarian needs and services, and for the protection of humanitarian workers, and for refugee operations to continue. And I wonder if in these discussions of contingency planning, whether it's a successful referendum or not, there is a discussion of whose role it is to provide for the appropriate security arrangements that also go to the security of persons on the ground, in addition to all the workers. Do any of you have a sense of whether that's part of the conversation?
Thank you very much for your question. There has been some discussion among UN agencies and with NGO partners and with UNMISS as to who would do what in any scenario. We have triggered something that is called the cluster approach. It's a division of responsibility among humanitarian partners that brings a sense of more responsibility and predictability over different areas of response. So we have divided the task. But when it gets to the security of people, our agency can provide some protection services, but we cannot certainly guarantee the physical safety of the people and access to the people. And for that, that's why we need a more robust protection of civilian mandate for UNMISS eventually before the referendum even.